I hope you're all having a wonderful Saturday morning. Today we are going to talk about the story of the Slavs. The Slavic people are a branch of the Indo-Europeans. They include the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, the Poles, the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Bulgarians, the Serbs, the Macedonians, the Bosnians, the Montenegrins, the Croats, um, and some smaller groups like the Sorbs, which usually don't get discussed. So the Slavic story begins, like all of the other Indo-European stories, with the Indo-Europeans themselves. You have a population on the western steppe, it's nowadays southern Russia and most of Ukraine, very flat, grassy area, which is great for herding cattle, herding horses, riding around. They go and they really start to coalesce around 4400 BC. 4400 BC is this era of total collapse across really most of Western Eurasia. You see the old early European farmer civilizations disintegrate. You see these hunter gatherer populations who are living on the periphery. And they go and they take over these former farming civilizations. And there's major migrations and collapses in Mesopotamia, the Levant, all sorts of things are going on. And part of this is you see this group, what's called steppe uh, ancestry, by the a lot of geneticists that forms in what's nowadays kind of the Middle Dnieper River area, like central Ukraine, around like Kiev, Chernigov, those areas. And that group drifts a little bit to the west, a little bit to the east. There are some like additional migrations. They incorporate a bit of farmer ancestry later on. But they're really kind of like they're not that remarkable of a group. Some of them do end up being enslaved over the course of the fourth millennium BC by their considerably more numerous and sophisticated neighbors to the west, the Cucuteni-Trypillian civilization. We do have a number of archaeological finds of people there with some of this kind of steppe Indo-European ancestry, fairly malnourished. I mean, extremely malnourished, I should say. Uh, you know, probably slaves or slave descendants. Now, this all changes around 3300 BC. You start to see kind of globalization really beginning. You have the invention of the wheel, possibly someplace in the Caucasus, in the steppe, or in the Middle East. Regardless of where it was invented, it spread very, very rapidly. And you also have the invention of the sail around the same time. So you have all of a sudden there's these huge there's this huge increase in trade. You start to see a lot of political centralization in some areas, like in Ireland, in Egypt. You have like the rise of the first pharaohs, and the Indo-Europeans, they are influenced by this. They are part of these trade routes around the Black Sea, and they do appear to get interlinked with these kind of trade networks and start to see this broader world. Uh, the other aspect that happens around 3300, 3200 BC is you start to see the spread of dairying to the steppe. So prior to like 3300, 3200 BC, these kind of steppe Indo-European tribes, they were very primitive. They had to live off like fishing and stuff on the Volga and Don rivers and the Dnieper. Um, After 3200, 3300 BC, though, they're starting to live off of cattle that they're herding across the steppe. So the cattle, they can eat the grass, they can milk. Basically, they're turning grass into meat and milk. So this makes the steppe all of a sudden much, much more economically valuable than it had been, since the sun's energy is being transformed into grass, and this grass can be transformed into beef or milk. There had been some attempts at agriculture prior to this, but the steppe was fairly flat, so it wasn't very defensible, and these tribes would always just kill each other. Um, and then there was the issue with the frosts too. So it was not a great area for agriculture really until the 19th century AD. So the Indo-Europeans, they have this huge population explosion right at the end of the fourth millennium, and you really start to see their demographic expansion to a lot of different areas. You start to see the Yamnaya culture; they spread into what's nowadays like Hungary, parts of northern Serbia. Some of them they end up in like the southwestern Ural region, where they start mining copper. That might be one of the reasons for their expansion. Maybe they could just make more copper daggers than their enemies could. Um, there's a lot of uncertainties. They also had fairly primitive domesticated horses that would have enabled them to act as mounted infantry. It doesn't seem that horses would have been able to act as like regular cavalry, where you're actually able to like charge an enemy formation until there were some changes in breeding practices towards the end of the third millennium. So it's still 1,000 years in the future. But having like the mounted infantry is still very, very useful. We do have some comparative history. We can look at the Amerindian tribes, where even if they didn't have like formal cavalry, the mounted infantry improved their mobility, improved their ability to raid, gave them over like the medium run, the courses of months and years, decisive advantages over their enemies that were limited to foot infantry. So the Indo-Europeans, they have part of their this Yamnaya culture migrates into out of the steppe region into kind of like this forest steppe and the proper forest region. So if you've been to Russia and Ukraine, you know that you have this like large flat area, and just north of that flat area, you have like this very densely forested area. So this branch of the Yamnaya, the Indo-Europeans, they migrate over this like forest steppe boundary into this forest area, and they become what's called the corded ware culture, and they mix with a group called the globular amphora culture. And the globular amphora culture, that was a mix of those early European farmers, which I mentioned earlier, along with the hunter-gatherer populations, which had overthrown a lot of the early European farmer states around 4400 BC. So these Cordovere people, they're mostly, I think, about 75% Maya ancestry and about 25% globular and foreign ancestry. And they kind of inhabit like maybe northern Ukraine, Belarus, parts of eastern Poland. And for reasons that aren't totally clear, probably around like 3000, 2900 BC, 2800 BC, they explosively expand and they conquer all of Poland, Germany, Scandinavia, the eastern Baltic, and just totally dominate these areas. The invasion seemed to have been pretty devastating. The ancestry of the groups that succeeds them in the following centuries is largely Cordobaran ancestry. There is like an increase in this kind of globular amphora ancestry. Some of the groups that they encountered, like the funnel beaker culture people, they were sort of like the globular amphora culture people, just with less hunter-gatherer ancestry and more early European farmer ancestry, and they kind of lived in like northern Germany, Denmark, parts of Scandinavia, or southern Scandinavia. They looked like they were almost completely wiped out. They did not contribute that much ancestry to the succeeding generations. Some of this, like successful conquest, appears to be related to the spread of like plague. Again, going back to like the invention of the wheel, invention of the sail, you have different disease pools that are being connected across Eurasia with fairly devastating results pretty much everywhere. Um, Although paradoxically, I do think this played a role in political consolidation of areas like Egypt and Ireland, where you have there were probably like these complex confederations, with like different local balances of power. You have like, five tribal chiefs who line up against seven tribal chiefs, and then if six of those tribal chiefs die, that reduces from plague. That reduces the number of like local power centers. You could like see how you could see a political consolidation just towards the end of the fourth millennium. This like kind of collapse of political complexity might also be one of the results for the Indo-European conquest. If you have like a few rulers, it's a lot easier to like if you just topple one guy, it's a lot easier than having to topple like 1,000 different petty chieftains. So it might have been like perhaps there's political consolidation in Poland, Germany, Southern Scandinavia, just like there was in Egypt and Ireland. There's not really much archaeological evidence for that, though, so I'm not sure if there could be, given that populations in those areas were not really dense. But do we could see like it is possible that there were these metastable political entities that were there prior to the arrival of these Cordovere Indo-Europeans, and that aided the conquest. So anyhow, like these Cordovere Indo-Europeans, they drive to the Rhine. They forge this fairly destructive Hunnic Mongol-like steppe empire on fire and blood. And eventually they just start feuding amongst each other. Some of them go back to the east, and this is where like the story of the Slavs starts to get important. So some of them they drive like all the way back across Belarus, back across Ukraine, into what's nowadays like Russia, up the kind of like the Upper Volga region, and into the Kama. So that's like past Moscow, past Kazan, into like modern day Udmurtia and Komi Republic to an extent. So those areas are not inhabited by farmers. They're inhabited by this race that really doesn't exist anymore. They're called the Eastern European hunter-gatherers in a lot of ancient DNA stuff. You also see mentions of them as the Velocevo culture. The survivors of the Velocevo culture, they migrate up to the Arctic. And the Velocevo people, they actually do have some surviving descendants. The Sami, back in the second millennium BC, they do pick up a certain amount of Velocevo ancestry as they're migrating to the west. But that's kind of outside of the topic of this discussion. I think I mentioned them in my Ehrlich space a few years ago, which is on YouTube. So these quartered-ware Indo-Europeans, they're driving back across Belarus, back across northern Ukraine and Russia. And the easternmost branch of these quartered-ware Indo-Europeans, they are the ancestors of the Indo-Iranian people. So like the ancestral speakers of like Persian, of Pashto, of Marathi, of Hindi, Bengali, they're like part of this eastern quartered-ware group. The ancestors, we don't have samples of the specific ancestors of the Slavs, but their lineages are fairly closely related to the lineages that are possessed by these Indo-Iranian people. So they were likely just to the west of the Indo-Iranians. And that leaves us the Middle Dnieper culture, which is kind of modern days like north central Ukraine and southern Belarus. So this Middle Dnieper culture, they kind of hang out for a few centuries from 2800 BC to about 2200 BC. And they have they do have interactions with groups to their west. Um, so what I think happened, we do know that there's these cultures, the Shrizao culture and the Komarovo culture, that for whatever reason are somewhat related to the Slavic populations that we have samples for from the historical period. um, So what I think happened is you have these Middle Dnieper quartered-ware Indo-Europeans, and some of them like drift to the west, and they come in contact with these quartered-ware people who are in like what's nowadays Poland. So around like 2200 BC, there's this whole other collapse. It looks like there were some major climate shifts all over the world. I wrote about this on my Substack, a crisis of the 23rd century. You see like Egypt disintegrate. You see all the stuff going on in the Middle East. There's these migrations in Siberia. There's a lot of stuff going on in East Africa, in India, all over the place. And this appears to have affected Eastern Europe as well. Um, so you have like the expansion of these Indo-Iranian groups to the west. They go and they take over the steppe zone. This is where you get the multi-cordoned ware culture. Uh, and then to the west in Poland, you actually have these, in Poland and the Baltic, I should say, right along kind of the Polish Baltic coast, like, Gdansk, whatever Stettin is called in Polish, those areas. You have the Indo-Europeans did not like totally annihilate their predecessors, and there's similar stuff in like the Baltic, modern day, like western part of Latvia, western part of Lithuania, Estonia. Um, the Indo-Europeans, they actually mixed with their predecessors on somewhat even terms. So you have the survival of these like hunter-gatherer lineages, whether or not they were spread from the hunter-gatherers or from like hunter-gatherer rich farming populations like the globular amphoras. It's not totally certain. It appears to have been like globular amphora populations in Poland and probably some of like the holdout hunter-gatherer populations in the Eastern Baltic. So we actually have like archaeologically, you have these corded ware artifacts that are next to these like Narva culture artifacts, in Latvia, in Western Latvia. And what it looks like is since the economy was so heavily based on fishing, the climate was very harsh for farming. The Cordobero Indo-Europeans seem to have like gone native to an extent, and they formed these kind of hybrid cultures. And these hybrid cultures end up playing a major role in the formation of the Baltoslav population. So there's kind of two populations that I could see as being the source for this excess hunter-gatherer population that we do observe in the historical period Slavic populations as well as contemporary Baltic populations. The first one is the Iwano culture, which forms kind of in the late third millennium BC in northern Poland. They are the result of a collision of a group of what are called bell beakers. They're an Indo-European group from the Low Countries. They drive to the east, I think about like 2400 BC, while they're also driving to the west and conquering Britain and France. And these bell beaker Indo-Europeans, they have like a moderate demographic impact on the Cordobero Indo-Europeans who are living kind of on the northern Polish Baltic coast. Um, but it's not like a massive demographic impact on them. The local Indo-Europeans who had mixed heavily with the hunter-gatherers do seem to have predominated. So this Iwano culture forms from like this combination of this Indo-European group that had mixed heavily with the hunter-gatherers and this Bell Beaker Indo-European group, which is related to the Bell Beakers that conquered Britain. Probably around 2200 BC. So this Iwano culture, they go and they're actually eventually, like a few centuries later, they form the Trzeniec culture, which dominates most of Poland. And the Trzeniec culture, it actually expands to the east as the Komarov culture or the Komarovo culture, depending on which archaeological text you're looking at, and also the Stryzao culture. The Stryzao culture and the Komarovo culture, genetically, they're almost identical. They kind of dominated the area from modern day southeastern Poland, western Ukraine, and they're the closest population from the Middle Bronze Age that we have to historical Slavic populations. So these Stryzao, Komarovo populations, they appear to migrate like further east, and they form the Sosnitsa culture on the remnants of this kind of like Middle Dnieper culture and these multi-cordoned were people. So we have this expansion of this Indo-European ancestry, which is rich in hunter-gatherer ancestry, onto this Indo-Iranian like cousin population on the Middle Dnieper around like probably 1900, 1800 BC, and they form the Sasnita culture. So that's one possible path. There's another path. Like I mentioned earlier, there were also collisions of the Indo-European corded ware people on the Eastern Baltic, where they come in contact with the Narva culture, and that's where they like learn the fishing and stuff. This group, I'm not as confident, was the source for this kind of like hunter-gatherer rich ancestry for the Baltoslavs, because it doesn't line up necessarily for the Y chromosomal lineages. It doesn't explain why there's like these bell beaker lineages in kind of the Proto-Baltic Slavic population. But it's possible that they did play a part. So this mixed corded ware Baltic hunter-gatherer population that's forming very early in the third millennium, they go and they form the North Belarusian culture by the end of the third millennium, which appears to have been like it looks like a lot of the actual like absorption of these hunter gatherers for the North Belarusian culture came fairly late in the third millennium when you start to have the change in climate. It changes the type, it changes the salinity of the Baltic Sea actually. So you have a shift in the species of the Baltic Sea. Which would have presumably had an impact on fishing populations and advantaged these pastoral populations that were not as dependent on very narrow tolerances for water salinity. Um, so you do have like this North Belarusian culture that swallows up the last of the Baltic hunter gatherers, and this North Belarusian culture, it does kind of like filter down into central Belarus, and there is like a fair amount of contact evidence for contact with like the Sisnitsa culture, Czecheniec, all these groups that are expanding out of Poland. So I don't think that's the dominant group for forming the Baltoslavs, but it could have been like a component in the expansion of this like hunter-gatherer rich ancestry into the Middle Dnieper River. So 1800 BC, we have the Sisnitsa culture. It's kind of the easternmost part of this Czecheniec world, but genetically, my guess is once the samples come out, they will turn out to be even more like Balto-Slavic. They'll be closer to the Balto-Slavs in ancestry than either the Komarovo or the Strizhau cultures that we actually have samples for. So this culture, I think this is like the proto-Balto-Slavic community. They kind of dominate southern Belarus. They dominate northern Ukraine, and they really reign for like 5 or 6 centuries without too many difficulties. You do have like the rise of other Indo-Iranian groups like the Shrubnaya culture. They go and they drive and they kind of conquer the Western steppe. They displace the multi-cordon ware culture. Um, there is an interesting point, though, that there are a lot of like Shrubnaya finds within Sisnitsa culture sites. So the interesting thing about this is that the Baltic branch of Balto-Slavic, the Baltic branch of Indo-European, that's Latvian and Lithuanian, as well as Old Prussian, it does not share a lot of the Iranian words that the Slavic branch of Balto-Slavic has. So that actually suggests that kind of like the true home of the Balto-Slavic languages might be like the northern parts of the Sisnitsa culture in what's nowadays like southern Belarus. Um, or the very early stage of the Sisnitsa culture prior to the contact with the Srubnaya was Balto-Slavic, and you have like a very early split off the Baltic, branch from Balto-Slavic, which there are some linguists that do argue that the split of Baltic and Slavic was about 1500 BC, rather than like 1000 BC, as some people do put it. Um, so if they're right, and I'm increasingly leaning towards them being correct, kind of the northern part of Sisnitsa culture would have been the ancestors of the Baltic people, and they would have eventually migrated up after the collapse of the North Belarusian culture during the Bronze Age collapse. They would have become, I think it's like the brushed pottery culture. In what's nowadays like Eastern Latvia, Eastern Lithuania, and eventually like overrun Lithuania and or the western part of Lithuania and western part of Latvia proper, prior to migrating into what's nowadays like Kaliningrad, Kashubia, those areas that were Baltic within the historical period. Um, so the southern part, though, that's definitely the Slavs. They kind of last until the Bronze Age collapse. Bronze Age collapse, 1200 BC. There's a great book about it called 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed. It's by Eric Klein. He argues that there's a systems collapse. So the center of the world back then, as can be guessed from a lot of Egyptian and biblical texts and stuff from Mesopotamia, was definitely like the Eastern Mediterranean. You have these huge trade networks that are spanning all the way to Central Asia. They're spanning to East Africa. You have amber coming down from the Eastern Baltic. You have tin coming from Britain. You have copper coming from everywhere. You have lapis lazuli coming in from Afghanistan. There's this whole world trade network that's linking in all of Western Eurasia, and it's enabling uh, these large scale states and empires to form, because it was very difficult in the past, really until like the last 100, 200 years, for leaders to collect taxes from their people. Because, I mean, if you think about it, it's like you have to send out a tax man, he has to go to the peasants. A lot of the peasants, they're not going to have any money, so he has to like take their crops away from them. And they don't want to give up the crops. They're always going to have like peasant rebellions and, all sorts of people, town leaders and whatever, that are going to try to fund rivals who don't want to take as much food and goods from you as you do. Uh, so the like great strength of a lot of these leaders was in trade, because it's very easy to tax trade, right? You have strangers coming to your ports, to your towns. They don't know anyone there necessarily. It's very easy to take a portion of their stuff and redistribute that as gifts to the people whose support you want to win, to make them dependent on you because they have their own retainers that have to be paid off with various luxury goods. So there's this whole like gift economy that's forming around trade, and it's fairly sophisticated. You have like actual trade agreements. There's state bureaucracies, even in fairly small states like what the Minoans had in Crete. So it appears to be far more widespread than that. Uh, so all of this, though, is very dependent on trade. And as soon as you start to have these massive droughts in the Middle East and East Africa and in India around 1200 BC, this whole thing starts to break down. Like all of a sudden, people they want to trade their luxury goods not for other luxuries from abroad, but for food. And we do see that from certain letters in parts of the Middle East. I think in like Syria, there's a bunch of letters from Ugarit where they're trying to just buy all the food they can with everything they have, and ultimately they don't get it because sea pirates go and start blockading their ports and eventually sack their city. So this collapse, though, even though we have records from it from the Middle East, it does appear to have affected Eastern Europe and all sorts of other places as well. So in Eastern Europe, you actually have, like in Ukraine, metalworking just ceases to exist. Like they had to import their copper and tin since there weren't any local sources that they knew of at the time. So people just go back to using bone and stone there. In the Sasnitsa culture, it basically disappears for like, I think, 100, 150 years. And like their sites just vanish. Obviously, it was not a good time to be a Baltoslav. Um, so it looks like a lot of them, the reason the sites didn't survive is because they just fled into the swamps, which is, something the Slavs have been doing even as late as, I think, 1943, when you have like the partisans, they're fleeing the German army and they're just hiding out in the swamps, like raiding the, German supply lines and whatever. So this is like a common thing for the Slavs to do in history. They run away to the swamps where, people correctly understand that there's nothing they're worth fighting for, so they just kind of leave them alone. So after like 100, 200 years or whatever, the Slavs, they come back out, they form a new culture, which hangs around for like a century or two until there's this arrival of a group, probably related to the Dacians and the Thracians, who are recorded in Greek and Roman histories. And they kind of mix with the southernmost survivors of this, Slavic culture, and they form the Chernolis culture. The Chernolis culture, they reign for a few centuries, I think from like roughly 1000 BC until like 300 BC, roughly. And they're like a mix of Slavs and like Thracians. They appear to be like the groups that Herodotus was talking about, where they're like Greco-Scythian hybrids. Um, and the very first people, they build a lot of fortifications. They have to, I mean, they have to just to survive against these kind of like the Cimmerians and these other very powerful, like the Scythians and all these other very, very powerful steppe confederations. So the Chernolis, I think if like we have some other sites, and one of their sites does have what appears to be like a very early Slav, but most of their ancestry does appear to be like a mix from like these Balkan ancestry rich groups with a lot of like early European farmer ancestry, um, with like the the Chernobyl culture eventually they go and they get completely destroyed around like once you start seeing like additional populations expand from the west, um, whatever like a lot of the remnants were likely incorporated by the Slavs who are expanding out of their swamps again to join in with like the new Gothic kingdom that was forming at the beginning of the Christian era. So you have like the Veilbart culture that starts expanding uh, into like Poland over like previous German groups that had migrated from Scandinavia into Poland. I think around the time that Jesus was born, and these Gothic groups eventually they go and they form like the Kingdom of Oyum in modern Ukraine. They largely displace the people that are there before them, but they also do appear to be somewhat open to like the arrival of these Slavic groups, and the Slavs are the mix of like the original Slavs with the a little bit of the journalist ancestry. As you do see for the Slavic populations, unlike the Baltic populations, they do kind of lean a bit more towards like the Thracian samples that we do have. So the first Slavs that actually emigrate from their original homeland in Ukraine, they actually like go west with the Goths. We do have some samples in Spain, I think two of them, that are very clearly like 75%, possibly more, Slavic in ancestry. Um, so this was, these were guys whose grandparents were like hanging out in the swamp. They joined up with the Goths for whatever reason, probably because the Goths were just recruiting like anyone they could, and they migrated all the way to the west with the Vandals and stuff. There are some archaeological bits of this too, like there's stuff from the Veilbart culture, that's the culture associated with the Goths, that we find in like southern Germany, that we find in France, that we find in Spain, that we find in North Africa. Like there's a specific type of pendant, I think there's like 80 examples of, and every single example of the pendant is found in a context where like Goths are known to have been. So there's a lot of cool stuff like that. So that's kind of like the first Slavic migration out of their original homeland. Um, the migration period, you have like in the beginning, it's mostly the Germanic tribes, right? As they're overrunning the Roman Empire. You have like eventually though you have the Huns, right? And the Huns are the most destructive ones. The Huns, they're one of the groups that they are a fragment of the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu were this empire that caused the Chinese all these problems. And the Xiongnu, as we know, they were actually very heterogeneous. They had a lot of different groups that were part of their tribal confederation, and they mixed together in like various degrees. And eventually, some of these like mixed fragments formed. Some of them formed the Huns. They formed the Turks. They formed the Avars, whatever. Um, so the Huns are like the first of these post-Xiongnu groups that drives to the west, and they're very fearsome. They have all this experience from all these centuries of fighting these very intense wars with the Chinese, who were the greatest state in the world at the time, and they actually managed to drive the Germans out of most of Eastern Europe. So there are some historical records. And there's actually a few archaeological, artifacts that suggest that the Goths had actually expanded a lot further east than we expected. Like some of them may have made it as far east as the Kama River, like modern day Udmurtia, Tatarstan, that area. It's just, they were probably like, roving merchants, nomads, whatever, war bands, not really like extensive settlements. So the Goths, they were defeated decisively by the Huns on the steppe. They fled east, and the Huns just keep on migrating to the west as the 4th and 5th centuries continue. Eventually, Attila, he becomes the leader of like this largely Germanic kingdom, even though it's led by the Huns, and he invades Gaul, invades Italy, causes the Romans all sorts of issues before the empire, like his steppe empire on the west, finally implodes. So after he finally dies, things do not get better for the Germans. You actually see, these. There had already been a number of exoduses of the Germans west across the Rhine, where they, it seems that the tribes they really did just move entirely from Germany into like Gaul, Italy, the Balkans, Spain, North Africa, just because of how bad the Huns were. Um, Things got even worse though than the Huns because you eventually have a volcanic eruption. I think in 534 AD, I believe was the year. And this volcanic eruption, it goes and it actually, like, it devastates everyone. Crop yields everywhere fall. I think there's records in like Korea or something about how it was like the most miserable period in Korean history. Um, and this affects naturally the more northern areas much more severely than other areas. The Baltic, there's massive decline in the 6th century of archaeological finds in the Baltic, and there's really not many archaeological artifacts in eastern Germany at all. It looks like the area was basically just vacated entirely by the Germanic people who inhabited it for several centuries. So that leaves us with the Slavs, who are still hanging out in their swamp. Not all of them left, and they just have this like vast emptiness that surrounds them now. So some of them, they go and they migrate into what's nowadays like Eastern Germany and Poland, and that's where you get like the Western Slavs. It's a fairly simple, populating a terra nullius. You have, these groups. They have a very primitive culture. They're not reliant on large scale polities. All they need is just land, and their little like male dominated clan networks will take over. So they just populate everything, and that's where you get the West Slavs. It's something like 80% population turnover between the Germanic period and the Slavic period in terms of population. So there's really not that much mixing with the prior population at all. There were some back migrations of Germanic groups. They migrated down to Italy. They intermarried with like these Roman women. They actually brought them up into like what's nowadays Austria and Eastern Germany. Those groups appear to have been just completely wiped out by this, either by the volcanic eruption and the resulting famines, or by these Slavic migrations. So that's the story of the West Slavs, the Poles, the Czechs, the Slovaks. Eventually, they form a kingdom. There's this Frankish merchant named Samo. He forms like the Great Moravian Empire, and that's like the one of the big early Western polities for the Slavs. The To the south, it's more interesting. You do have the Romans. They're trying to hold on to the Balkans, even if they're dominated by these, various Iranian tribes like the Sarmatians, or these Germanic tribes like the Herulists and the Rugii. Um, the Avars, they're a group. They appear to be like kind of para-Mongolic, related to the later Mongols, as well as I think the Shanbei dynasty, um, or Shanbei people, sorry, of East Asia. They go and they follow the Huns. They were part of like the Rouran Confederation on the steppe. They lost a struggle, and they decide to flee all the way to the west, where they become the Avars. The Avars did this very fearsome confederation. They fight the Romans all the time. They actually besieged Constantinople and Thessalonica during the kind of last epic war of the early 7th century between the Sassanids and the Romans. And during their migration, they clear out a lot of people from the Balkans, and this is when like the first wave of Slavs enters the Balkans. The Romans, they do have texts about how like there's all these Slavs that the Avars are bringing with them, how they're like, they can breathe underwater because they have their straws, basically primitive snorkels that they'll, use to swim. Um, and this is one of like the main waves of Slavic migration into the Balkans. There are two additional waves of Slavs into the Balkans, though, and that's why you do have some heterogeneity in ancestry for modern Yugoslav populations. So there's still some that are coming into like the 8th century. In the east, you have the Slavs, and you've got like the Avars and the Huns. They've hollowed out like a lot of the peoples who are to their east in what's nowadays like northern Russia. And the real advantage that the Slavs have, though, is they're introduced to new crops and new methods of agriculture by their newly, you know, by I guess people who are like coming back from the south. So these the Slavs, they the most crucial invention though is winter rye. Like it's this rye is a grain, it's a cereal, and part of the issue with a lot of crops in the north is they die from frost. They're very sensitive to the cold. So even though rye had always been more common in the north than other crops, like wheat, rye, there's a specific type of rye which was invented in the 9th century, which was unusually resistant to cold, had some sort of protein in it, which just prevented it from freezing as easily. And the spread of this type of rye among the Slavs in probably the late 8th or early 9th century enabled this massive population boom. And this is what leads the Eastern Slavs to kind of take over what's modern day Russia. So rather than being like a kind of warlord driven conquest, it was really a demographic expansion where you have, these people who they're very limited in the ecologies that they can exploit. All of a sudden, they can exploit a much larger range of ecologies and demographically swallow their, largely Finno-Ugrian and, East Baltic neighbors. The Eastern Balts do appear to have colonized kind of the area all the way as far like east as Moscow, maybe Nizhny Novgorod, prior to the Slavs. Like a lot of the rivers, they have Baltic names, not Slavic names. Culturally, this is suggested as well. Um, so these, a lot of these Balts were, apparently destroyed by the Slavs. The ancestors of the Russians. So you have like the Eastern Slavs, the Russians, the Belarusians, the Ukrainians, although they call themselves, those national distinctions weren't, they didn't exist back then. You had much smaller tribal confederations. Uh, it was only after the Viking era, so you have like the 10th century, the eighth, really like the ninth and 10th centuries. You have the kind of rise of the Vikings, and you have these Germanic groups, and they oppose themselves on a lot of these Eastern Slavic tribes, and that they form what is called the Rus people. And that's where you get um, the beginnings of like the unity of the Eastern Slavic people. You have the kind of beginning of the collapse of a lot of the tribal distinctions. Um, in the West, you have the formation of the Polish kingdom. In the South, it's very complicated, and I'm sure there are Balkan historians who could give you a much better overview of what I could. So by 1000 AD, you have like the rough outlines of the Slavic peoples for you have the Western Slavs, Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, South Slavs, roughly the Slovenians, all the way down to the Bulgarians, and then the East Slavs, the Rus. The the Poles eventually are getting pushed back by like waves of these Germanic migrants. The Polish society was not as sophisticated as the Germanic society. The Catholic Church wasn't as strong in Poland as it was in Germany. So you didn't have like this political skeleton to tie the Western Slavs together as well as tied together the Germanic peoples. So the Germanic peoples made some slow progress in kind of like overrunning, absorbing, or destroying the Western Slavic populations over the centuries. So, like modern East Germans were roughly like, maybe 50% German, 60% German, 40 to 50% Slavic in ancestry. This is kind of complicated too because Poles today, they're maybe like 30% Germanic in ancestry, maybe a bit more. There's a lot of like internal heterogeneity within the Polish population because once you see the rise of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Poland and Lithuania actually become surprisingly influential, or perhaps not so surprisingly since it was a fairly massive kingdom. And these German colonists that they had brought to introduce technology, to do mines, to do trade, all these other things, they actually were kind of Polonized culturally. So you do have like a lot of Germans who become Poles, Poles who become Germans, um, in a fairly complicated ethnic mosaic. The When they were all Catholic, that was actually fairly easy since the strictest social dividing line back in the Middle Ages, it was not so much ethnic or linguistic as it was religious. So it's really the spread of Protestantism in northern Germany, particularly after Albrecht Hohenzollern converts to Lutheranism in the 1520s, and he secularizes the Teutonic Order, makes it a secular duchy of Prussia. That's really what kind of makes the dividing line between the Germans and the Poles in the East. Um, Protestant Poles would, like people who were Protestant and spoke Polish, they would have a tendency to eventually become Germanized because the liturgies were in German, whereas, people who were like Germans who remained Catholic would have a tendency to be Polonized, since, the liturgies would have been in Latin and their social circles would have been Polish. There were like it was more complicated than that, of course, very complicated topic. There's a number of good books on it. Um, Peter Frost, not the poet, but the historian, or not Peter Frost. There's a historian Frost. He's written a number of books on Poland and Lithuania. There's a book called The Northern War, or The Northern Wars, which is very good. He has a number of books on the formation of Poland and Lithuania as well. Um, he goes into it in considerably more detail, just like the different rivalries between the institutions, how acculturation happened, you know, how extensive bilinguality was, what identity was based off of in a lot of Eastern Europe. It's very, very fascinating reads in a lot of cases. I've done a couple of book threads on his stuff. Um, to the east, you have the Rus. Uh, they really start absorbing a lot of the Finno-Ugrian populations, I believe, in like the 13th century. You start to have Vyatka, like roughly Udmurtia, Komi El, Kirov oblasts of modern day Russia. They go and they get overrun by these winter rye eating Slavic peasant hordes in the 13th and 14th century. They absorb a lot of like the Udmurts, the Mari, those kind of groups. On seemingly even terms, a lot of the Mari uh, seem to have been granted like noble status if they were tribals rather than peasant status. So they were able to like intermarry with the Russian nobility, they joined like Russian families. It was just like demographically, they didn't have too much of an impact since they were still like largely, they had like their pigs, they had, they did a lot of hunting, and they just couldn't sustain the same kind of populations that the Slavs did. But there are like quite a bit of very clearly Finno-Ugrian um, male lineages that are present in the Russian population as a result of the assimilation of these, various groups on the Kama and on the Volga. Um, the devastation of the Mongols in the 13th century really hurt the Finno-Ugrians and the Turkic groups along the Volga and the Kama as well. The Mongol conquests, they're like stereotypically on the steppes, where you have like the horde of Mongol horsemen, they overrun the city, kill everyone. They actually ranged pretty far north too. There are some Mongol chronicles and like historical records where they talk about how they're going to these lands where the sun never goes beneath the horizon. Where they find the homes of various birds in the summer, just so they can kind of train them to be reliable for hunting and searching things. So a lot of these groups, like the Udmurts, the Mari, especially the Moksha and the Erzya, were actually like quite devastated by the Mongols for these reasons, in a way that some of the more peripheral Russian principalities were not. So that's another reason why you start to see kind of the Slavic predominance in what's nowadays Russia in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries. There is some pushback against this. You do see in the wars between the Tatar, that's a Turkic group, Anat of Kazan, versus the Grand Duchy of Muscovy in the 15th and 16th centuries. You do see like a lot of these Mari and Mordvin groups. They do try to hedge their bets between them. There's some groups, they were very strongly religious, usually Christian. They of course like completely supported the Russians, but other groups, they're still like mostly pagan, perhaps like partly Muslim influenced. They did lean more towards the Hanat of Kazan. um, so they did try to like hedge their bets, keep their independence, preserve their status, try to negotiate better details with both the Grand Duke of Moscow and the Khan of Kazan. Ultimately, though, between two warring powers, their model of life, which was still heavily tribal, wasn't going to last, and they were eventually defeated. However, since they lived on peripheral lands, a lot of them were still able to be incorporated, as nobles on fairly decent terms by the Russians, if they were kind of like upper class, or if they were peasants, they were unserved, and things were kind of unfortunate for them. Uh, you do see like there's a phenomenon which was going on as late as the 19th century, where you have this kind of like counter nationalism forming along the Volga, where these various groups like Chuvash or Udmurts or Moksha, they would actually assimilate into becoming Tatars just because they did not want to be Russian so much. The Tatars were like the main. They had like a counter language. They had a language that was prestigious. They had nobles who were like accepted and prestigious. They had religion that was not the same religion as what the Russians had. So there were some things that kind of like delayed assimilation into Slavicness. I think the total demographic impact of the Finno-Ugrians and these various Turkic peoples and the Russians. It's actually surprisingly minor, but it is very, very noticeable in certain Russian subgroups, like the Pomors, the extremely famous mercantile branch of the Russians, which was on the White Sea, played a huge role in the colonization of Siberia. The Stroganov family, they were famously Pomors. They look like they're probably like 30 to 40% Finno-Ugrian in ancestry. You also do see Russian populations, the northern states, that are relatively more like Finno-Ugrian admixed. They tend to have like, I think, an extra couple of IQ points on like the more southerly Russians, which kind of lines up with what we see where like Finns and Estonians tend to have like better test scores once you adjust for all sorts of things than more other European populations. Um, my impression personally from visiting Udmurtia was a lot of the Russians there had like an Udmurt parent or grandparent, so there's still like a lot of ongoing absorption and Slavic expansion in the area. So the Slavic expansion, you actually see a kind of Slavic retreat in the Balkans. At the same time, you see the Slavic retreat in what's nowadays like Poland and Czechia as a result of the Germans, although it was from the Turks instead. Um, However, it's fairly late. The Ottoman state was good at mobilizing large numbers of men. It could raise large armies, but it wasn't that effective at mobilizing capital for a variety of reasons. Um, a lot of the areas in the Balkans, they just kind of let be ruled by their own local communities. They just had to provide like soldiers, the janissaries for the armies, but they weren't necessarily like that well developed. It's noticeable even today, just with like the infrastructural and institutional legacies. Um, the Ottomans, they did start extensively colonizing the Balkans in the 18th and especially 19th century, where they start bringing in a lot of refugees from the Caucasus who were fleeing the Russian expansion there. And Bulgaria, I think in the 1860s, prior to the Bulgaria becoming virtually independent, was only about like 55% Bulgarian. The rest of the population was Muslim, a mixture of like Turks, Circassians, and some other groups. Like there were some Chechens there. Um, so you do see that kind of like pushback against the Slavs, but ultimately it was reversed as a result of the Russian army, the Bulgarian uprising, and a fairly brutal, actually a very brutal campaign of like ethnic cleansing, which drove like all of those various Muslim groups and Muslim aligned groups back into what's nowadays like Turkey proper. Um, the In Eastern Germany, like the those lands were basically just lost to the Slavs forever. You do see the Sorbs. They are basically an unmixed, like West Slavic group, identical to the Slavs who colonized Eastern Germany after all the Germans left in the early 6th century. Other Sorbs had been gradually absorbed over the centuries. There's stuff, I think, from like Martin Luther, where he talks about the Sorbs and he saw them as like primitives who weren't Germans and supported like racial purity laws against them. Um, those were, obviously not enforced over the long span because a lot of them were assimilated. There's very clearly like Slavic lineages in a lot of these Eastern German populations, and indeed for a lot of the Eastern German nobility that we have historical like lineages for, a lot of them were like these Germanized Slavic chiefs. So the Germans, they keep on pushing east, whereas they had been at like uh, they had been in like West Germany during the migration period. They reached like the German borders by roughly 1100, and they pushed into like Silesia, Prussia, and even further, uh, by the early modern period. That was reversed by the Slavs as well. With the First World War, where Poland retakes a number of territories, Czechia retakes a lot of the borderlands that have been German for I think about 600 years by that point, and eventually, you have World War II, where the Soviet Union ethnically cleanses a lot of the German population from Eastern Europe and forces them back to their about 12th century borders. So prior to the Teutonic Order carving out this Germanic sphere in the East. So the Slavic world, that's where it stands today. I think I'm coming up on the 1 hour mark, and I'll open it up for questions and answers. Stuart Denethor, you were good to speak.
only got here at the tail end of this, so I might have missed it. But is there any veracity or truth to the idea that the Slavs originated as pastoralist groups within the Sarmatian Confederacy and then sort of ethno had an ethnogenesis sometime in late antiquity and then migrated westward?
No, I think the earliest Slavic samples we have are all with the Goths. I don't think they were associated with the Sarmatians at all. There were probably some like mixed, like Thracio-Slavic people that were like in with the Sarmatians, but not like the Slavs as we would understand them. Bundesrat, you were good to speak.
Hey, what's going on? I was wondering, what do you think about the Carpatho-Rusins being descended from the White Croats?
Yeah, I believe it.
Yeah, could you go into more detail about who the White Croats were?
Not really. I mean, I know they were one of the recorded tribes. I think. I mean, was it Procopius who was like the first one to record them, or was it someone else?
I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, but it makes sense just given like where they are that they eventually got absorbed into what are the nowadays the Rusins. The historical Hierophant, you were good to speak. Yeah, the historical Hierophant, are you there?
Oh yes. Do you endorse
Yes.
Adolf Hitler?
Damn it. I said yes just as you were saying that. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Sorry. Um, yeah, so my question was like why haplogroup I2 in the Balkans? How did it get there? Like, was it just spread by a group of Slavic men in the Dark Ages who settled that region and brought it?
Yes, I think the I2 comes from one of either either the Iwano culture or the North Belarusian culture, and they introduced it into the like Proto-Balto-Slavic population. Um, back in like the Sisnitsa period of the Middle Bronze Age, and then eventually it expanded out from the Slavic population into the Balkans.
And do you know, like, just off the top of your head, what percentage of ancestry like modern Croatians have from Iron Age Slavs versus like Romano Illyrian? Is it like 50 or is it less?
I think it's like 60% roughly. I need to look back at the
Okay.
paper.
It would depend probably if you're talking about coastal populations or interior populations. The coastal regions of modern day Croatia remained under Roman control much longer than the interior did. For example, I think Salona didn't fall to the Avars until like the late like 582 or something. And then and then there's evidence of Roman material culture continuing under Avar rule and later independent Croatian rule into the ninth century.
That would make sense because like, didn't even the Venetians controlled the coast for like a long time. So I imagine they would have been even like into the high Middle Ages, maybe
Yeah,
got like
I wish I could
more
find it
Romanized.
now, but there's an article about sort of early Middle Ages Slavic principalities in the Yugoslav area that had a lot of Roman material culture and seemed to derive some sort of, at least the ruling chiefs, princes, whatever, seemed to derive some sort of legitimacy from adopting Roman symbols, Roman iconography, etc.
It's also one of the Croatian islands has people with Y haplogroup Q, which is downstream of some Avar lineages. So some of the, not all of the Avars were wiped out by the Franks. Some of them did escape to, I think, the island of Hvar. All right, Bleobaharis, you were good to speak. Bleobaharis, are you there? I guess not. Slavko, you were good to speak.
Croatian ethnogenesis. I am Croatian and a big history buff, did a lot of research about this. And there is a new study. It comes from Chobanov and Stamov, two Bulgarians. It came out just last month, so I'm not surprised that for most of you it maybe went under the radar. It is called Slavs in the Closet, and it's about specifically the Croatian population formation. Basically, they identified three distinct waves of immigration of Slavic groups. The first one, it was the most Slavic, and it was actually in the 6th century. They believe that this is the group that actually created the Croatian identity, and it is the most direct. It seems to have come from the Western Ukraine, basically from Galicia, and that is precisely where the so-called White Croatia was. Now, the word Croat, which is the English way of saying Hrvat, it probably meant something like warrior, because in modern day Croatian, Hrvanje is activity of wrestling. So that is the probable etymology of the word. The high concentration of the I2 haplogroup is likely just a founder effect of such an early migration. What was happening in the mid to late 6th century is the severe consequences of the environmental and disease effects on the Roman Empire. Basically, the Justinian plague cleared out a lot of the Balkans, and this vacuum was filled up by these early Slavic groups. The other two immigration waves were the so-called Avaroslavs. There is actually, I believe, 2 or even 3 research papers from this year alone, so 2025, which show that Slavs in the Avar context practice something akin to apartheid. Basically, they found that for around 8 generations, 2 villages in modern-day Far East Austria, these 2 villages, despite being one next to the other, they did not have even one example of mixing. One village was essentially pure East Asians, the other one was basically Slavs. And so this group was the second wave of immigration to modern-day Croatia. The third wave was a later one, around 9th century probably, and this one is likely to have been to the southern part of what was, at least in the early medieval times, identified as the Croatian land. This is sometimes called Red Croatia, which is basically the territory of Dubrovnik, Herzegovina, or at least like the eastern Herzegovina, and possibly Montenegro. I have maybe something that we can construe as a critique. I think you did a bit of downplaying of the Slavic ethnicity in the, let's say, self-identified non-Slavic communities, such as the Hungarians and the Romanians. Maybe that is a touchy subject, but basically on all of these research papers, whether it is Gretzinger et al., whether it is the Turkish paper that came, I think, 2 years ago, or by amateur archaeogeneticists using tools like QPDNA or G25. Basically, both Hungarians and Romanians are essentially like 2/3 Slavic.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was very informative. Does anyone else have any comments, questions, criticisms? Tony Soprano, you were good to speak.
Yeah, I just had a general question about in the 6th century when there was this big Slavic push towards the south, I guess you could say. Is that mostly caused by the volcanic eruption, like this 80% population turnover that you mentioned? It's like an absolute vacating of areas, or is it like a conquest type thing? I'm just curious. Yeah.
I think in Eastern Germany it's basically just vacating empty areas. The Germanic peoples who've been there before just picked up all of their stuff and left. Um, the Balkans, it's a lot more complicated. You did have like a lot of Roman troops were still there. You still had like a lot of Germanic and even Iranian tribes like feuding over it. I think it really wasn't until like a lot of the Slavic migrants in the Balkans, it wasn't until the early 7th century, actually, during the great, that last, I think it was like the 26-year-long Roman Sassanid War, that a lot of the Slavs like poured into the Balkans because the Roman army was so occupied fighting either each other or fighting the Persians.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Any comments, questions, criticisms?
So for people who are interested in the Southern Slavic migrations and so on, they can read the book that came out this year. It is called The Early Slavs, The First Centuries of Eastern Europe by a British academic, Susana Torres Prieto. And it details a lot of the battles that the Southern Slavs were waging in the Balkans. They were basically raiding, they were trying to capture cities, and the early raids were essentially just something like closest to proto guerrilla warfare. While when the Slavs would sense that they can actually win cities, they would bring everybody, like men, women, kids, the old people, and they would siege the cities basically until they all die or the city gives up. And one of the people asked, which I missed previously, like, what is the percentage of Slavic to pre-Slavic DNA? Among Croats, it is depending on the study and the samples that they use between 65 and 75%. It decreases the further south you go. So the North Macedonians, they are about like 45% Slavic. Bulgarians like 50%, and you get some Slavic in the Greeks, like 25%, 18% in Albanians, maybe 10% in the European Turks.
Thank you very much, Slavko.
You're welcome.
Anyone else? Comments, questions, criticisms? Well, thank you very much. Or Historical Hierophant, did you have something to say?
No, sorry. I think I just forgot to. Sorry, I forgot to mute myself.
All good. Well, thank you very much for your time, and I hope you guys all have a wonderful Saturday. Enjoy your day.